Hey there! This video is all about the recording formats and modes for shooting video in the Canon R7. We'll be doing a series of tests here to compare these different modes and help you decide on which one you should use in which situation. We'll be covering the 4K fine versus 4K line skip mode in 24 frames a second. We'll be looking at IPB versus the IPB Light codecs, 4K 60 in terms of the line skip mode versus the 4K 60 crop mode, and we'll also be looking at 4K 60 autofocus performance. If you're curious about how to set up your R7 to shoot video, I made a detailed video about all the settings that I use, and I'll leave that link down below for you to check out. First of all, let's talk about the non-slow motion stuff. So this is like 4K 24, 4K 30. I'm gonna be using 4K 24 for all my tests because that's what I use, and this is a 24 frames per second timeline. So there's two 4K modes in this camera. There's the 4K fine, which is the 7K oversampled image. It's a very detailed, very sharp image. Looks awesome. Then there's the 4K non-fine mode, and most of us call that line skip mode. Well, I don't really know if it's line skipped. I don't think Canon is releasing how they are not oversampling their image but still getting a full readout, but we'll call it line skipped. And I also want to compare these 4K modes with the 1080p out of this camera, because maybe the 4K line skipped isn't that different from the 1080p. So for all these tests, I shot them on the R7 obviously, but I used the RF 15 to 35. I figured that would give me the best image quality and best autofocus. For all these tests, I shot them in C-Log 3 in 24 frames per second with the IPB codec. So let's take a look. The results from this were really not that surprising. The 4K fine mode, that 7K oversample, definitely looked the best. It definitely looked better than the 4K line skip mode. And I was really curious about the 1080p, and when I compared it against the 4K line skip mode, I could definitely see the 4K line skip looked better. Now, of course, you're looking at this video in a 4K timeline, so the 1080p has been upscaled, so just keep that in mind. Now, the other thing that's in here is that for all these modes, you can shoot them in IPB or IPB Light. Now, this camera doesn't have all I, but you probably already knew that. In terms of bitrate, so in the 4K modes, the IPB is 170 megabits per second, and the IPB Light is half of that, so 85 megabits per second. So let's take a look and see if there's any difference in terms of image quality. I didn't see much of a difference in terms of image quality between the IPB and the IPB Light, so it might be worth experimenting with IPB Light a little bit more. I know this is a pretty simple example here. The IPB Light is half the size of the IPB codec, so it would be great for long form stuff, interviews, things like that. Now keep in mind that whenever you're using a more compressed codec, it can be more taxing on your computer. Now I didn't have a problem with either of these two codecs because I use an M1 Max Mac Studio, and I don't think any of the M1 Max would have trouble with these codecs, but you might want to check that out. Also keep in mind that if you're stacking multiple layers of it, of course the IPB will be easier on your computer, so a lot of stuff to figure out there, but I'll probably stick to using the IPB codec because the 170 megabits per second is fine with me, and I like to have a little bit more bitrate if I possibly can, and my projects tend to be pretty simple. Now, if you're getting value out of this video, I would really appreciate if you could hit the subscribe button down below. I know most of you are not subscribed to this channel by looking at my analytics, and it really does help the channel grow, so I really do appreciate that. Also, this video is not sponsored and is made possible by all of you, so if you could do me a favor and check out the affiliate links down below, that would also be greatly appreciated. Now let's talk about the slow motion or the 4K 60 modes. And so there are two different 4K 60 modes. There's a 4K 60 non-fine, which the line skip mode, which is the same as what we were talking about in the 4K 24. And there's also a 4K crop mode, which I believe, from what I understand, is a 1:1 readout. So it should have more detail. It should be a little bit sharper. From what I could find, and this was a little bit hard to find this number, that 4K 60 crop mode is a 1.81 times crop on top of the already 1.6 times APS-C crop. So it is pretty punched in. So there's gonna be some limitations there. So for these tests here, I shot the 4K 60 crop mode at 15 millimeters and the 4K 60 line skip mode at 27 millimeters. So take a look. I definitely think the 4K 60 crop mode looks better than the 4K 60 line skip mode. This is really no surprise because the 4K 60 crop is supposed to be a 1-to-1 readout versus the line skipping in the 4K 60. But again, you have to deal with that heavy crop, and sometimes that can be a challenge. So after looking at just the straight up image quality, what I wanted to do is take the camera outside and take a look at what this looks like in slow motion. Of course, as I said, we're shooting this in a 24 frames per second timeline, and when we shoot in 60 frames a second, I'll slow it down to 40% so you can check that out. I put this in a pretty challenging situation, so I had face and eye detect, human detect autofocus on during this test, but what I did was I walked in and out of shadow and sun, and so it was a little bit more challenging for the camera. So take a look, and then also at the end threw in some 1080p 120 frames per second. Overall, I'm not really surprised by the results from this, and I think the autofocus worked pretty similarly between those two modes in 4K. So I'd probably recommend shooting in the 4K 60 crop mode if you can, because it does have more detail and it looks better. Of course, you have to manage that crop, and as you can see in this example that I just showed you, is that you get a very different looking shot. So, you know, for the 4K 60 line skip mode, I could shoot at 27 millimeters on the 1.6 times crop, which gives you a lot more compression in the background, gives you a lot more bokeh. These are both shot at the same aperture, but they obviously look very different. So you have to be careful about that crop, and if you can make it work with the lenses that you're using. Also, if you watch the video I made about the overheating times for the R7, which I'll leave linked down below, the 4K 60 crop mode overheated a little bit faster than the 4K fine mode. But in short bursts, I don't think it's much of an issue. If you're curious about the 1080p 120 frames per second, that's really cool that it has that. Just keep in mind that it automatically changes the frame rate to 30 frames a second. So what I did, the example you saw there, was I just slowed it down another 80% of what it normally was to get to work in 24 frames a second. Overall, these results really didn't surprise me in any of these modes, but I really wanted to put these examples out there because I was getting a lot of questions. I know a lot of people at the moment when this video is coming out are still waiting for the R7s to come in because they're back-ordered, or they're just curious if these modes will work for them in their workflow, so I'm happy to share. If you did enjoy this video, as I said before, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It would really be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.